Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the France 24 interview. With the world watching with much interest the FBI's investigation into possible collusion between the Trump presidential campaign and Russia, other issues dogging this administration have somewhat taken a backseat for the moment. This as concerns continue to rise over human rights abuses in America. Now, watching all of this very closely is Vince Warren, the Executive Director for the Centre for Constitutional Rights based in New York, and who joins me in the studio today. Vince, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, let me start with the question that, as a veteran civil rights campaigner, can you give us a sense of a state of the nation, if you like, about the current situation facing civil rights in your country right now?
Civil rights in the United States has been tested multiple times over hundreds of years. And this is one of those great tests that we have currently happening under the current administration. There is both a wave of activism and a wave of energy pushing back against some of the terrible things that our administration is doing in the United States. But there are also some challenges. And amongst the challenges that we have is that the President of the United States currently and his cabinet and his government are trying to essentially undo all of the rules that we have established for our democratic principles, all of the rules that have been established in civil rights work over the last 50 years, and to try to undo them one thing at a time. And so that creates a tremendous challenge. On the positive side, people understand what's happening, although some of the technical pieces, and for lawyers, lawyers will spend more time on those than other folks. But here's what we know. We know that the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, is undoing all of the work that we've fought for in terms of keeping the police from killing unarmed black people. We know that affirmative action, which has been a long fight in the United States, is being rolled back. We know that the environmental rules are being rolled back. We know that the police departments are being fueled and with all sorts of new money. But the other piece that's happening is that our legal establishment and our campaign establishment in the United States is pushing back constantly and all the time. There have been probably hundreds of lawsuits that have been filed in just the first 9 months of this administration, which must set some kind of record. And the other thing is that we're largely winning. The courts understand that when the president seeks to gain power and to roll back rights just because he says so or in a tweet, that does not make a democracy.
And you're seeing that, for instance, with the travel ban, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. The travel ban is a classic example. The travel ban, there have actually been 4 travel bans, and every time that those travel bans have been challenged in court, the courts have said, no, President Trump, you can't do this. We've also seen with that a tremendous upsurge in activism and people taking to the streets. It's never before happened in the United States when thousands of people would go to the airports impromptu with signs that say we all belong here and push back against that type of administration.
But the reality is that America today is a polarized nation, isn't it? And the fact that you have somebody of that nature in power, clearly with sizable support from the electorate, gives you a sense of just how divided a country it really is.
Well, the country has always been polarized, and it gets polarized towards different poles depending on who the president is. So that's a tremendous challenge that we have. But we do know that 38% or 39% of the country supports his policies, which means the vast majority of the people in the country do not. And the question for us is really not so much about policy, but it's about values. And are we going to be a society that holds those of us who happen to have gotten here last week versus people who founded this country, Native Americans in the United States? Are we going to be in a place where they are being honored and their experiences are being honored and they help to shape a better society? Or are we going to be a society that really is only for primarily straight white men that are dictating the rules? We've been there before, and I don't think we want to do that again.
But some of these issues, as far as civil rights activists are concerned, particularly, say, issues of surveillance and counter-terrorism measures, these are things that didn't necessarily begin with President Trump. They do hark back to the previous administration, if not other administrations, don't they? That's
right. The black surveillance or surveillance of black protesters goes back actually 100 years. I think the first situation that was documented was in 1912. In the 1960s, with the Black Panther Party and those types of movements, surveillance then was on the rise. Again, it's happening. But here's what's different about this. The Black Lives Matter movement and black activists are people that are leading with love. This is a leaderful movement. A lot of the movement leaders are women. A lot of them are LGBT. That's the first time we've seen that kind of leadership in the black community in the U.S. And they're being talked about as they're terrorists. And they're not, of course, being terroristic. What they're doing is they're standing up for the rights of all of us. And most people in America see that and express that. But the pushback and the surveillance, which is very deep, and even the latest FBI has been calling these folks black extremists as opposed to Black Lives Matter protesters or activists, signals the shift that the administration and the FBI is going to start criminalizing protest activity. And anytime that happens, that's the road to fascism in our country and any country.
And let's talk about race relations, because from people abroad, from what we can see, it seems to have reached a low point with an administration in the White House who seems to be okay with white supremacists rallying, protesting, using violence to get their message across, which is extraordinary when you think that, over a year ago, you still had the country's first black president sitting in the White House.
It's quite shocking. And, if you follow that strand, we have a president now that is essentially supporting white violent extremists at the same time that he is calling black peaceful protesters violent extremists, at the same time that he's trying to label everybody that's Muslim in the world as a potential violent extremist. So his trope, the thing that he's trying to move forward is that anybody that disagrees with his policies, anyone that is really pushing for more inclusivity and diversity, is someone that has the potential for violence. And criminalizing that behavior, of course, requires a law enforcement response. So that's where we are. Very similar to where we were in the 60s when they called the dogs on protesters. Now they're calling the FBI.
The President has been very clear about how he wants a global anti-terrorism efforts to be very much coordinated multilaterally with the likes of Russia and Saudi Arabia. What kind of impact is this going to have on the US image abroad, and what does it mean for the nature of relations with those countries and others?
Our image abroad has been tarnished, I think, frankly, by the orange glow of our president. And you don't need much more than that in the tweets. But I think when you add to that the types of alliances that he's building with countries that have very proven anti-human rights records on a variety of ways that are involved in the sort of global chess game in terms of geopolitics, it sends the message that the U.S. is going to start creating alliances with strong men or strong governments. And that's not the way towards diplomacy. There's no nuance in that. And we're going to be in a situation now, unfortunately, where the next president is going to have to do a lot to walk back the damage that this president is doing. And
when you talk about damage, is it irreparable? Or can it be fixed, if you like, by future administrations?
Well, anything can be fixed if you wait long enough, and that's our big challenge. If you think about what this president is good at and what he's not good at is building consensus with his own country to move policies forward. That's why all of the legislative efforts have failed. That's why the courts are pushing back. So what he's doing is he's taking unilateral strategies, changing the rules, withdrawing from accords and agreements, and even though that's a problematic position to be in now, that's also something that the next president should be able to actually move back and put us back on the course that we were under President Obama.
But it's not just him, is it? I mean, it's also the Republican Party. This is a man who's at the forefront, at the leader of a political party that still supports him.
Well, there's a lot of discussion about whether Donald Trump is actually a Republican or not. And rather than going into that, I do think that the right wing of the Republican Party sees a lot of value in how he's pushing. I think the moderates in the Republican Party and the moderates in the Democratic Party are very concerned and very worried. And what needs to happen is that the Republicans in particular are really going to have to start thinking more about values than thinking about what their opportunities are here. Because the country and the democratic principles are slipping into the well, and we actually all need to be working together to make sure that that doesn't happen. And looking at those types of outcomes for Republicans is just not a non-starter for them.
But given what you've just said, do you despair for your country, Vince?
I never despair for the country because I think as difficult as it is, the United States has been in this position before. My parents were telling me about what it was like under the Civil Rights Movement. Folks that were of Japanese ancestry have been talking to me about what it was like in World War II when Japanese Americans were interred in camps here. And what people have constantly said is that the rule of law does win out. And so that's where we're focusing our efforts on, is that it's going to take a while to to get there. But leave aside the tweets and leave aside the horrible rhetoric. What we need to focus on is making sure that our rules stay intact so that he can't do too much damage and we can get back towards building the society that we want.
Vince, having listened to what you've just said, the reality is you still need to get that message across to the voter. How do you do it?
It's a bit of a challenge, but I think the most important thing that we need to focus on are the questions of values. And what are the values that we want to be having in this society? I think if we just focus on policies, if we just talk about battling Donald Trump's ideology and we don't really talk about what's happening to real people, people won't get that message. I've seen situations where people have changed their views with respect to Trump's policies when they begin to really understand what they mean for real people. I've seen examples when people change their views of Donald Trump when they realize that a lot of the promises that he's making for them just actually can't come true. So I think we have to continue to tell stories, and I think we have to be focusing on the people who are persuadable. Not necessarily the hardcore Trump supporters. They're not going to believe anything that I have to say. They think everything that we talk about is fake news. But there are a number of people who really get moved by the idea of what these policies actually do to people, their friends, their neighbors, and people that they care about. And that's the way that we need to change their votes and change their views.
Vince Ryan, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Do stay with us here because coming up shortly will be more news and headlines.